discussion. My name is Chandra and I will be the moderator for today's session. Our panel today examines the theory of comparative advantage to explain real-world trade patterns. So this is one of the most fundamental yet enduring ideas in economics, first articulated by David Ricardo in 1817, and it continues to shape how nations trade with one another today. Joining me are Gyalsang Choden, Chinyangi, Rinzemomo, and Karmazamo, who will walk us through the theory. Who will walk us through theory supported with real data from 4 countries and critically assess its implication for trade policy. So let us officially begin. Let us start with the theory itself. So Gyalsang Choden, could you explain the theory of comparative advantage and why it is relevant to understanding the trade patterns?
Thank you, Chandra. The theory of comparative advantage was developed by David Ricardo in 1817. It states that a country should specialize in producing and exporting goods in which it has a lower opportunity cost, even if it is less efficient in absolute terms compared to its trading partner. To illustrate, suppose country A can produce either 10 units of cloth or 5 units of wine using all its resources, while country B can produce either 6 units of cloth or 4 units of wine. Country A has an absolute advantage in both goods. However, country A's opportunity cost of cloth is 1/2 wine, while country B's is 2/3 wine. Country B has a comparative advantage in both. Therefore, country A should specialize in wine and B in cloth, and both countries gain from trade. This is a critical distinction from Adam Smith's absolute advantage theory. Ricardo showed that trade is mutually beneficial as long as there is a difference in relative productivity, not absolute productivity. This underpins the argument for free trade and explains why even developing nations engage profitably in global trade. The theory predicts that trade patterns will follow comparative advantage. Countries export goods in which they are relatively more productive and import goods in which they are relatively less productive.
Thank you, Gyalsang Choden. So now moving on to the second panelist. You have examined trade data for the United States and China. So what does the number tell us?
Thank you. I will now discuss the trade pattern of USA and China, which are the 2 largest economies in the world. Starting with USA, according to the WTO and US Central Bureau 2023, the US mainly export high technology and capital-intensive products such as aircraft, semicolon, and petroleum products and pharmaceutical goods. On the other hand, it imports consumer electronic, clothes, and other low-cost manufacturing products. This shows that USA has comparative advantage in the production of high technology goods. This is because countries have skilled workers, more technology, and strong infrastructure and high investment in research and development. As a result, USA can produce complex products more effectively than many other countries. Now, looking at the China, its major exports include electronic mechanism, textile, furniture, and mechanical appliances. China mainly imports soybeans, irons, and semicolon. China has a very large labor force, which gives its comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing. This means China can produce goods like electronic, garments, and low-cost compared to Western countries. The trade relationship between USA and China clearly support the theory of comparative advantage. In 2023, the trade between the 2 countries was about $575 billion. The USA imports more from China than it exports. This happened because USA focused more on high-tech industry, while China specialized in large-scale manufacturing and low-cost production. Overall, this trade pattern of both the countries strongly support Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, where countries specialize in the production of goods more relative advantage.
Thank you, Tsuneki. So now moving on to the next panel member, we have Rinzemomo. So you have analyzed the data closer to home, India and Bhutan. So what patterns emerges?
Thank you, Jami Sinjan. Let me take India first and then Bhutan. India's comparative advantage has evolved significantly according to the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, India in 2023. India's top exports include IT and software services, which cost 194 billion, pharmaceutical products 25 billion, refined petroleum 78 billion, and textiles. Its top imports are crude oil, gold, electronics, and heavy machineries. India's large English-speaking educated workforce gives it the distinctive comparative advantage in service rate, particularly software development, IT-enabled services, and business processes outsourcing. This is a fascinating case because Ricardo's original model focused on goods, yet services rate follows the same comparative advantage logic. India's opportunity cost of providing IT services is far lower than in the USA or UK due to the wage differences and skill availability. Now Bhutan, a small landlocked kingdom with a population of under 800,000. According to the Royal Monetary Authority of Bhutan and the NSP, Bhutan's trade statistics show that in 2022 to 2023, total exports were appropriately Bhutanese neutral 28 billion. Bhutan's top exports are electricity, hydropower sold to India, accounting for nearly 40% of exports, followed by ferrosilicon, dolomite, calcium carbide, and cement. Its top imports are fuel, vehicle, machinery, rice, and consumer goods, predominantly from India, which accounts for over 80% of Bhutanese total trade. The theory maps perfectly here. Bhutan's endowment of steppes, river valleys, and glacial water gives it an extraordinarily low opportunities cost for generating hydroelectricity. It would be highly inefficient for Bhutan to try to manufacture vehicles or electronics when it can specialize in clean energy and export the surplus. This is comparative advantage in its most natural form.
Thank you, Rinzan. We now have a strong empirical picture. So moving on to the next panel member, we have Karmazango. So you have been tasked with critical lens. So what do the policy implication looks like and where does the theory fall short?
Thank you, Jamyang. The theory of comparative advantage strongly supports free trade, but in real life it also has some limitations. According to the theory, countries focus on producing goods and services they can make at a lower opportunity cost and trade for the rest. For Bhutan, this means focusing more on areas like hydropower and value-added minerals. Export instead of trying to produce products such as car or heavy machineries, where Bhutan does not have an advantage. Similarly, India has a strong advantage in services, so the trade agreements should also focus on service industry, not only goods. However, the theory has several limitations. First, the comparative advantage can change over time. For example, the South Korea did not originally have an advantage in semiconductors, but through government support and industry-led policy, it's later become a global leader. Second, the Ricardo's model is very simple because it assumes only two countries and two goods, while today's global trade system is much more complex. Modern products often pass through many countries before they are completed. Third, even if trade benefits a country overall, some people or industry may suffer. For example, the Bhutanese weaver may struggle to compete with cheaper imported goods from India. Therefore, the government needs policy and support system to protect affected workers and industry. Fourth, the theory assumes all resources are fully employed, but developing countries like Bhutan may face unemployment and unused resources. So, the theory may not always work perfectly in practice. Finally, depending on natural resources like hydropower may not guarantee long-term development. Bhutan also needs to develop more advanced industry and move up the value chain over the time. So in conclusion, the comparative advantage is an important theory that explains why the country is trade, but policymakers must also consider economic development, fairness, employment, and long-term growth when making the trade policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Karmazango. That was richly nuanced analysis. So let me now open up the floor for a brief interactive discussion. So my first question is for Rinzan Momo and Kelsang Chodin. So given that Bhutan is heavily dependent on India for both export and import, does comparative advantage fully explain this trade relationship, or do other factors play a role?
Thank you, Jamil. That was a great question. Comparative advantage does not explain a large part of it, but genuinely has lower opportunity costs in hydropower and mineral extraction. However, geographic proximity, historical ties, currency pledging of neutral to the Indian rupee, and preferential trade agreement under SAFTA all amplify the trade relationship beyond what pure comparative advantage would predict. So the theory is necessary but not sufficient.
I'd add that dependence on a single trading partner, India's accounting for over 80% of Bhutanese trade, also poses a vulnerability. If India imposes tariffs or restrictions, Bhutan's export revenues can fall sharply. This underscores panelists' 5 point about the limits of specialization without the diversification.
So that was a great point. So now moving on to the next panel member, Triyanki. My question is for Triyanki. So how does the USA-China trade relationship challenge or support the theory, especially given current geopolitical tension and tariffs?
I think the US and China trade relationship both support and challenge the theory of comparative advantage. China has advantage in low-cost manufacturing and US is in high-tech production. This supports the theory because both countries specialize in different sectors. However, political tension has also affected the trade. Since 2018, the USA has placed a tariff on many Chinese goods, which increase cost of businesses and consumption. So comparative advantage explains much of the trade relationship, but political and government policy also plays an important role.
So to add on her points, this perfectly illustrates the gap between the economic theory and political realities. The theory tells us what is efficient, it does not tell us what government will actually do. The trade policy is shaped by lobby groups, electoral cycles, national security concerns, and strategic interests, all of which lie outside Ricardo's two goods model.
Very well said. So now that brings us nicely to the closing. So thank you to all our panelists for an insightful discussion. To summarize what we have established today, the theory of comparative advantage, first proposed by Ricardo in 1817, provides a robust framework for understanding why nations trade and what they trade. So through the real-world data from 4 countries, the United States, China, India, and Bhutan, we have seen that trade patterns do largely reflect comparative advantage. So USA export high technology goods, China export labor-intensive manufacturers, India exports services, and Bhutan export hydropowers and minerals. So at the same time, our discussion highlighted important limitation. So the theory assumes static endowments, ignores distributional effects, and is often overridden by political and geopolitical consideration in practice. So for Bhutan, specifically, the theory supports continued specialization in hydropower and natural resources in the short term, while policymakers must also invest in dynamic comparative advantage. For Bhutan, specifically, the theory supports continued specialization in hydropower and natural resources in the short term, while policymakers must also invest in dynamic comparative advantages, education, technology, and economic diversification to ensure long-term development. So thank you for listening. This concludes our panel discussion for today.